The first step in creating a functional permaculture design is getting all the information to support the design that you're going to undertake. So that's in the first stage, doing the site analysis, but also obtaining the needs of the user and finding out the resources they have to support production. You then apply it to your understanding of the principles of permaculture and the patterns expressed within natural systems. As far as the principles of permaculture go, at the broad scale, it's earth care, people care, and fair share. So earth care is the understanding that in the design of a permaculture system that it should be regenerative, that as a consequence of producing organic and nutrient-dense food, you also help look after the soil, protect natural environments, and don't create any waste or pollution that can impact negatively any surrounding wildlife areas. As far as people care, is producing a high quality product free of toxins, so it's organic, but also nutrient dense, so the soil's been looked after, there's lots of recycling of minerals and nutrients, and it's a healthy, biologically active soil, and all of those minerals and nutrients are then available to be put into the plants and then available to us through eating those plants. And also through the production of those animals and plants in a permaculture farm system, that humans aren't exploited, that the environment created to produce those products also nurtures and enriches the lives of the people that produce those production crops. And as far as fair share goes, is acknowledging that some of the crop of vegetables and fruit will be taken up by the surrounding wildlife, and that also the produce that we sell, there'll also be a surplus that we can fairly distribute within our community, either in exchange for other resources or to those in need. So they're the broad principles of permaculture, and then at a finer scale is recognizing things like creating closed loop systems on the farm that recycle resources, selecting production species that have at least 3 benefits. So for a chicken, for example, it can have an action that's beneficial to the production on the farm, so it can spread manures and mulches, it can remove pests, it can help control weed growth in orchard areas, as well as produce products such as meat and eggs and feathers. And also creating 3 beneficial interconnections between production elements on a farm. So the chickens again can be integrated into an orchard area and help control the pests and the weeds in that area. They can be integrated into a vegetable production area, and they can help spread mulches and manure that system, and also take out any residual crops and weeds in preparation for replanting that area. Or they can be moved following cattle, and they can help spread out the manures of that cattle, and they can help take the worms and pests out of those manures so that they don't reinfest the cattle once they're in that area again. So it's trying to align the function of your elements in that system so that they have beneficial interconnections, and in that way they help replicate the functional diversity of a natural ecosystem. And then as far as understanding the patterns that are expressed in nature, is to try to create production systems that are modelled on the functional diversity of natural ecosystems. So to try to create those beneficial guilds of plants that would be representative of the natural guilds of plants that you get in those ecosystems, and looking at the functions of insects and birds and animals within those natural ecosystems, and thinking about what kind of agriculturally productive species you could substitute them for and replicate the function of those plants and animals and insects within the production systems that you set up. So for example, if it's an open woodland type environment with, say, cattle moving through it, you could select a tree crop that are resilient to the browsing of those cattle. So it could be a big nut crop, or it could be a forage tree for the cattle that are moving through it. It could be a nitrogen fixating tree, or it could be some sort of windbreak. But thinking about the interaction of the browser to the tree crop you have, and creating mutually beneficial interaction between the two, so that the cattle are controlling the weeds, they're providing manures for the trees in exchange are shading the cattle, helping to extend pasture growth in summer months when it would otherwise dry up. They can provide nutrients to the soil ecosystem that also help support plant growth, and they can help absorb and store water in the soil to also prolong pasture growth in dry months of the year. So these are some of the understandings behind the establishing a permaculture design, is really understanding the characteristics of the site, the needs of the users and the resources they have to support production, and then having at your disposal a knowledge of the permaculture principles and the patterns of nature, so that you can apply that to the design of regenerative farm ecosystems. And then it's a matter of looking at the context of the site itself, and how is the interplay of water and topography and soil, how could those elements be best utilized for different types of production on that farm site. And that requires an understanding of things like sun angles at different times of the year, so what areas in the landscape receive the best amount of sunshine, what areas on the landscape have the most fertile soil, what shelter is there on the landscape from prevailing winds, and therefore which is the best areas to locate more sensitive tree crops that could be damaged by those winds, and what areas are more broader in expanse and less managed and could be better utilised for pasture animals or tree crops or semi-managed wilderness areas. And the final element, and often the start to helping place all these elements together, is the location of the house site, because you want to locate the elements close to the house that require the most frequent attention and maintenance to be sustained. So things like intensive vegetable production, things like maybe a worm bin, compost piles, things that need quite frequent attention and use, you want to locate as close as possible to the house site. And then as you're moving further away from the house site, you want to locate elements that require less and less maintenance to be sustained, until you go all the way out to the wilderness areas where you have very infrequent interaction with, and those areas should be buffered so that they interact positively with surrounding natural environments. So the steps towards establishing that overview of the location of elements on your farm is first to do a sector analysis, and the sector analysis identifies those elements of where is the fertile soil, what areas are receiving the best sunshine, what areas are sheltered from wind, what areas are of different distances from the house site. And then based on that sector analysis, you can then establish zones of production. So the zone 1 is like your high intensity kitchen garden type production that's close to the house, and then the zone 2 is still quite frequently interacted with, and it's things generally like an orchard or chickens or some other smaller animal perhaps that requires daily monitoring. And then your zone 3 could be a pastoral system, where it could be an open woodland with pasture animals associated with it, but generally some sort of combination of tree crops and larger pastoral animal in that zone 3 area. And then your zone 4 is your sustainable forestry, which is trying to produce ideally timbers native to that region and that can be sustainably harvested. And then outside of that, your zone 5, which is your semi-managed wilderness areas that should blend seamlessly with the surrounding natural ecosystems. And then there may be elements within that farm site, such as wind breaks and areas of natural significance, or wetlands or streams or lakes or rivers that have natural significance, and they can help organize the specific location of those different zones on your property, and to try to create interconnected corridors between areas of natural significance. And also topography will have a big impact on what areas can be farmed for what purpose, due to the practicality of farming on steeper areas, but also the potential of negative erosive impact on areas of steeper slope. So locating grazing animals, for example, on areas that are flatter or moderate slope, so that they don't have a negative impact through trampling and movement on areas of steeper slope. So it's through an analysis of all these variables where you start to create first your sector analysis, and then identify the different zones of production on your property. And then once you've established that, you can start to develop concept sketches for each zone, so decide what type of production would suit each zone, and then what kind of beneficial interconnection you can make between those production systems to arrive at your final design once you've figured out the best interaction between all your production systems that you've investigated within your concept sketches. And then the final element of putting it all together is to create a management plan where you outline how you intend to develop those production systems, how you, what kind of successional strategies you need to employ to set those production systems up. And then on an ongoing basis, how are you going to ensure that there's a recycling of fertility in that farm system, that you've got buffering from any potential negative impacts from surrounding properties, and you've got a long-term view of restoring the fertility and the productivity of that farm site, and diversifying your production, and potentially doing different stages of production. So you may have types of production that will result in a quicker yield, and then types of production that it will change into in the future, which have a longer term yield, but perhaps require less maintenance and can be integrated in with other activities on that farm to diversify income on that farm. So these are some of the factors to consider that we go into in detail in the Permaculture Design Certificate of how to outline these elements on your farm and apply them to a permaculture design for your property.